My name is Alicia Malarkey. I'm the director here.
Yeah, speak up a little bit.
Okay, will do. So, my name is Alicia Malarkey. I am the director here at the Driftless Area Wetland Center. We're happy to provide a place to meet today. We do a lot of environmental education here. We're run by the city of Marquette, which is just this little town. So we're not with the county or anything at this point. But we try to do a lot with what little we have here. But it's a great facility and a really lovely place in the Driftless area. So I am going to introduce Representative Chuck Eisenhart is here to introduce the speakers today, and just a couple of housekeeping things. If you need to use the restroom, it is at the end and to the right, restrooms. And we have some water over here, and I'll be here afterwards if anybody wants to chat about anything, but welcome.
Thank you. There are some extra chairs up in front if anybody's hard of hearing. We're going to try to project. The teachers should know how to do that. But if you're having trouble hearing, there are some seats up here in front. My name is Chuck Eisenhart, State Representative from Dubuque. I have in the past served on the Environmental Protection, Natural Resources, and Natural Resources Budget Committees in the Iowa House over the last 14 years. I am now currently on the Budget Subcommittee for Health. So I'm really taking a health approach towards environmental issues as part of that mandate. And before I get too far, I just want to thank the host, Alicia, for opening up the facility for us here. She's not responsible for this event, so from anything from here on out, blame me. Just want to thank her for making the facility available. I think it's a perfect venue given the topic. You have a great history here of doing public activities and public education. So I'm happy they see this as kind of an extension of their own work. Also wanted to find a facility that didn't make our speaker from Minnesota drive too far. Otherwise you'd all be in Dubuque right now. I want to mention a couple other folks here. Monica Kurth, who is my ranking member on the Agriculture Committee in the Iowa House, made the visit from Scott County. Thank you for coming. Marquette McGregor's own state representative, Ann Osmondson, is here in the front. Thank you. She's informed me that we have a couple county supervisors in the room. Dan Burns of Allen McKee. Dan, you want to? All right, here. And Doug Reimer from Clayton County. Thank you for making it. Any other public officials in the room? We need.
Ray Peterson, Clayton County Supervisor.
Okay. And
Bruce Lamb in Fayette County.
Fayette County's representative. Thank you all for coming. We also have a former state representative here, Patty Ruff, my colleague in the Iowa House for many years. She left to get a better paying job as the Clayton County sanitarian, but we've had a chance to work together on a couple issues over the years. A couple quick housekeeping items from me. I will have a couple words to say after the presentation, so I won't belabor you with my views on water quality issues at this point. I do want to bring your attention to a couple things. We have sign-in sheets in the front and back. You don't need to identify yourself if you don't want to, but if you want copies of the presentations and to be on a circulation list for future legislative and related discussions, activities, materials related to water quality, especially in the Driftless, I'll use that to communicate that information to you. You will get added to my legislative email list. If you don't actually want to be on it after you get your first copy, just unsubscribe yourself. I won't be offended, but it's one way that we can keep in touch with people on critical issues, especially as the legislative session goes on. And I'd be happy to share that sign-in sheet with Representative Osmondson as well, since many of you may be her constituents, and I don't know if you have a newsletter, but you can work that out among yourselves if you want to be in touch with her on that. So we have the sign-in sheets. I have a handout in the back. One of the speakers will have a handout as well. My interest in doing this was piqued when I read some news lately that there have been some developments in Minnesota related to water quality in the Driftless that we're going to hear about. It involves some petitioning of the Environmental Protection Agency. And then we have some folks who for a long time have been a source of great information to me regarding water quality in Northeast Iowa, and I wanted to create an opportunity for him, who I'll introduce later, to present that information to you. So first I want to introduce our first speaker, Jeff Broberg, who agreed just last Saturday to be part of this event. He is the founding director and current director of the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. He's a geologist by trade and profession, and spent a number of years in the private sector, as I understand. And he's gonna tell us a little bit about drinking water as it is an issue in the southeast Minnesota part of the Driftless. I'm sure he'll have many more things to say about himself, about why this, you can believe him, that this information is important to folks living in this neck of the woods. Take it away. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay through this? Is the sound okay? If it gets funky, let me know and we can adjust it. So, thanks for the introduction. I'm Jeff Broberg. I came from Elba, Minnesota today. I live in Dakota land in western Winona County. I have a farm there that we bought in 1986. It's a over 100-year-old farm. It was built in 1911. We believe our water well was drilled in 1911. It's 400 feet deep. The water level's at 180 feet. It had a windmill. And they had wind power and electricity 25 years before rural electrification. We have a large cistern that was the soft water system. They collected rainwater for soft water. But the well was for the cattle, in a cattle barn built in 1911 for 50 cows. So by all accounts, this was a wealthy family then. And they did very well farming on 220 acres. I have 170 now. I don't farm 40, I only farm 40% of it because it's sensitive land. But I want to go through a little more of my background. I'm a geologist. I worked for many years after college in the oil business and came back to Minnesota in 1986. So I'll be honest, I have guilt. There's a lot of stories about the oil business. But we bought our farm to raise thoroughbred racehorses. I have guilt there too. We didn't do very well. Our horses weren't fast. But I got a job and started an environmental services firm in Rochester, Minnesota. So me and my crew developed a staff of 30 to 60 people, varied seasonally, and worked in development projects around Rochester, and I did a lot of work with the geologic hazards, with groundwater contamination, with hazardous materials, and I'm a regulatory specialist. I had to get certified for a license, and they said there's 90,000 pages of environmental regulations, make yourself familiar with it. And we were tested. So that's one of the things I do. I read regulations. In the last 2 months, I've read the Safe Drinking Water Act twice. It's full of good information that I'll go over tonight. But I've titled the talk tonight, Who Cares? And we'll talk about that theme as we go, but I want to set some background first. My organization, we started in 2018 when I retired from corporate life. And we started the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. We had some good advice from university professors. Don't call it association because that would be Min-Wo or Min-Woo instead. That rolls off the tongue better. And we started with the idea and aspiration of providing free nitrate testing for our neighbors and people in the neighborhood. And we had the ability to loan sophisticated lab equipment that's funded by our legacy fund. Spectrophotometer that is very accurate for nitrates. So we started holding clinics, and 30 people, 45 people would show up, and we'd have their test results within minutes and share with them what we learned. And then COVID hit. So we took off and did, I think one of the best things was we started planning, and we brought together a lot of my retired geology, hydrology, engineering friends, about 30 of them, and laid out a process to roll out testing programs across the state of Minnesota that was reliant on volunteers and reliant on community support and reliant on retired professionals to come and consult with the people once we give them their test results. And our first clinic after COVID, we had 280 people in 4 hours. We promote the fact that we're not a government agency, we're a nonprofit. And we started off with the narrative that we wanted to stop the groundwater contamination. In Minnesota, we call that source water protection. But that made some people mad. They thought we were gonna blame them. And some of the advice of our planners were just talk about water at the kitchen sink. Just talk about the water at the kitchen sink. And give people the test results. You don't even have to keep them. They're for them. It's a service so they know what to do and provide good, accurate technical advice. So that's the path we've been on. This last summer, we held 8 clinics. Over 1,000 people attended the clinics. So we can handle about 100 people an hour before we get stressed out. It's very successful. Our aspiration is to do this statewide. That is a monumental task. We don't even know how many wells, private wells there are statewide. The best estimate we have is between 900,000 and 1.5 million. It's clearly a quarter of the population. Many people have multiple wells. So you can't just say, send me your samples. Don't try this at home. There's a lot of pent-up demand and desire for these services, and that's what we're trying to satisfy. So we put on these testing clinics to build community values, and we have an 8-week planning process. The first week, where and when. The second week, all of our partners. And we try to get schools and clubs and local governments and soil and water conservation and everybody that's interested in safe drinking water to come help us. And we put on the whole affair, and everybody has a great time. And we want people to remove and reduce the threats to their drinking water. We do other things. We're legal advocates. This was our filing to the US EPA. We started this in January last year. In April, we filed a 30-page petition signed by 11 parties and 60 pages of references saying that water in the area I live, the karst of Minnesota, is an imminent health risk. It's an imminent health risk. And people need to sample their water. They need to know what it is and treat it if necessary. And if you have good water, bless yourself and be thankful and think about how you keep it clean. It's an amazing area. I want to talk about some geology. This is, I think, the overlook here in the valley. This landscape, what we call the Driftless area or the Bluffslands, extends up into Minnesota, almost to the St. Croix River and down into Iowa and Illinois. Its principal characteristic is the bluffs and rivers and the general lack of glacial ice. In the area in Wisconsin that's named Driftless, there truly was no glacial advance in that area. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, there's some very old glacial till. We don't know, it could be 2 million years old, but there is a thin drape of it in some valleys and some, I have some on my farm, it's 2 feet thick, a few boulders around. But the characteristic that's most dominant, and the light area where the states come together, labeled the Driftless area, is showing the area that the soils are less than 50 feet thick. And the soils are overlying carbonate bedrocks, limestone, that's easily dissolvable in water. On my farm, I have dunes of this loess, this wind-blown silt, that are 35 feet thick, covering the rock at the summit of the landscape. And by it gets to the edge of the field, the soil's 2 feet thick. And in the rocky ravines that drain off my farm into the Whitewater Park, you can hear a sucking sound when the water flows down. The water does not leave on the surface of my farm, except during frozen ground events and rapid melt in the spring, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Otherwise, the water I generate is recharging my groundwater. We've come a long ways. The red area in the map on the left is the karst region of Minnesota. That's the subject of our petition for the US EPA because it shares the geologic origin characteristics of hydrology in the wells. And we've gotten very sophisticated. The map on the right is a groundwater susceptibility map for the deepest aquifer that shows we have nitrate contamination down at 400 feet in some of the wells, especially those that are near valleys and where the recharge areas are. I want to challenge you, when you think about groundwater, use a worm's eye view. Think of this from the bottom up. It's a different way to think about and understand the water, and to that end, I really suggest, if you haven't, go to a cave. Some of the best groundwater education happens when you're looking up at the ceiling and wondering where the water came from and how long it took to get there. And in some instances, it's been decades. In other instances, you can see it speed up if it's raining up above and you better get out of the way. But there's a lot of good show caves around here with trails. I think Spook Cave is not far away. Minnesota has Niagara Cave. Make an effort to go to a cave. It really does give you a view that deepens your understanding and appreciation for water. Some of our best conservationists in Minnesota were cavers as kids. And they're out there now changing the way they farm to influence the infiltration rate through the soils and the quality of the water coming through the soils. We have a really good group down in River Valley that's put together wonderful cross sections like this, and there's a handout we've passed around. I want to encourage you to go to the QR code when you get home, because there's a 3-minute and a 6-minute video about this that use drone photos, artist conceptions, and it gives you a real sense of how our precipitation so rapidly gets into the groundwater, and it gives you a deeper understanding with that worm's eye view. Here's a general cross-section of an area that's like my well. In the whole Driftless area, it's very much similar to this. We have layer cake geology, where the beds are almost uniform thickness for many miles. They extend throughout a wide region, and in the bluffs, they're exposed on the surface. Back into the hillsides, you have to drill deep wells. My well is pretty well represented here because it goes down into the Jordan aquifer, and it's pumping out multi-aquifer water. It's not cased, it's only 18 feet deep. So the water that it encounters up near the top of the well trickles down to the bottom, and we're now in an area where the entire section is contaminated with nitrates above the health risk limit. I've not been able to drink my water for over 20 years. But this is the standard cross-section and how this works, and there's areas off away from the bluff that are protected if you go deep, but still have shallow contaminated wells. 1986, my well had 8.6 parts per million nitrates. Every time I tested it, it got higher. Within 10 years, it was over 10. And it quickly rose to 22.2. I started first hauling my water. I have a friend in St. Charles where they test the water, they know it's clean, and I had a gym bag that had fit 6 1-gallon jugs and 2 5-gallon jugs, and every week I'd go to Mike's house and fill up my water. I did that for over a decade for a drinking water. I'm 70 years old. The chance of me drilling a $60,000 well is less than 0. There's a lot of cheaper options for me to have safe water. I now use reverse osmosis. and that's satisfied. It cost us about $1 a day for an installation that was under 600 bucks. But we have safe water. What we want to share with people is how we understand, and this is what we shared with the US EPA, the sensitivity of our groundwater. This is the Jordan Aquifer. Here's another cross section that shows how this works. On the left-hand side, we show the Decorah Shale. It's kind of famous around here, named for Decorah. But that horizon does not allow groundwater to percolate straight downward. It pools up and it exits on the hillsides where it's carved off, and then there's a recharge point right above the worm there. You can see how the water cascades down the little blue arrows and flows out towards the river valleys. Behind that, it's often safe water. City of Rochester is in this setting. They have 36 wells that have the Decorah Shale protection. They've only ever had to take out one well because of nitrates. It has a natural protection because it has that Decorah Shale, but the water above it, we condemned the use of that aquifer in 1955. So no more wells could be drilled there because it wasn't safe. If you look at the layer cake, the upper Cummingsville, the top rocks in our area, there's not very much that has aquifer quality, and I know you can't see the dots, but it's full of sinkholes. Sometimes 20 sinkholes a square mile in these areas. And rapid infiltration, there's no surprise where the water goes. It doesn't flow into the streams. It goes into the ground, through these cracks and fissures, and it comes out in springs nearby. The next deepest horizon that's an aquifer is the Prairie du Chien. That red color is representing infiltration of recent water where it only takes hours to months for the surface water to be in the drinking water. If your well is a Prairie du Chien well, I used to get these calls. My water turns cloudy after it rains. What should I do? Don't pee in the yard. You're drinking the surface water. And it's more common than you think. In our well testing clinics last year, we found 2 Civil War era wells. Built in the 1860s, hand dug, rock lined, still in use. That's their water supply. Whether we think that's safe or not, that's what they rely on for their family. In one of them, we always ask if people know how old their well is, and they said, well, no, but it's in the basement and the house was built in 1860. That's a salamander habitat, by the way. There's nobody I know with a cistern that hasn't had salamanders. And it's a public health risk in itself, and we've updated the codes for that. Minnesota in 1974, same year as the Safe Drinking Water Act, and Olmsted County in 1955, that said you have to have aquifer. If you go down, you have to pass by the first contaminated aquifer and have cased and grouted wells so that it's safe. We know the science about this. We have a ton of data. We also measure chloride levels. It's interesting, chloride is not present in the waters in Minnesota at all. So if you have high chloride levels, it's usually from road salt or water softener salt. It's a rough surrogate for age. In Minnesota, we didn't use road salt till 1960. Water softeners were invented in 1958. So if you have high salt levels, which we see frequently, you're drinking water that's been at the surface fairly recently in our lifetimes. But knowing all of this, detailed geologic atlas, hydrologic studies, dye trace studies, all kinds of information, a catalog of information going back 50 years, we haven't been able to change the trends. What shocked us in putting together the document for the US EPA is every public document of every state series of well tests going back to the 30s had higher nitrates every year. There's no evidence that all the money we've spent in conservation efforts and the lip service that we've given to those improvements have done anything to help. And what we found, like I said, it doesn't help to blame people. We have to understand what these are and take responsibility for the elements that we can. Minnesota's promoting a plan to make what they call drinking water safety plans. It's very similar to community water plans under Safe Drinking Water Act, but it's different in that you start with the water chemistry at the kitchen tap, and you look backwards all the way to the source to see where the risk is. Is it in your plumbing? Is it in your water treatment? Is it in your well? Is it in your yard? Is it in your aquifer? And you understand who's best to manage the risk. And you start asking those people to help. And that's the petition that we put together. There's a legal background in this. Safe Drinking Water Act will be 50 years old next year. It's different than the Safe Drinking or the Clean Water Act. It is a health ordinance. It is focused on assuring communities that have more than 15 connections have safe water. And it requires communities that have that to do testing of the water frequently. And if it's contaminated, to assure treatment and safe water. And to have communications with their water users and risk management plans that reduce the risks. And there's a host of things that communities were required to do, but private wells weren't mentioned in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Minnesota in 1974, the same year, passed our Minnesota Well Code. And it gave large parts of the responsibility to our Minnesota Department of Health, and they regulated for public water supplies and private wells, well construction. For community water supplies, they also required testing, mitigation of contamination, protecting the source water, and funding for construction. But they didn't apply those to private wells. If you lived right outside the city limit, or even in the city and had your own well, you weren't protected by these. Minnesota said private people have to seal their wells certain ways, so they only deal with the construction, the birth and the death of the wells. And that hasn't been adequate to protect our drinking water. In 2018, US EPA issued a memo about emergency powers, that they parsed through the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they said communities are connected by pipes, other people are connected by their aquifers. If you are private wells and share, and they use all kinds of terms and acronyms, underground sources of drinking water, if you share underground sources of drinking water, we can be treated as a community. And the state would be required to provide us services under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Yakima Valley in Washington petitioned under the same thing, and the US EPA took it up in 2019. And today, they're putting in community water supplies funded by the US EPA. They have a water hauling system where 8,000 gallon water trucks come out to people's farms to provide them water so that their livestock are safe. Those are things that happen because of the emergency petition. They took it really seriously, and we met the requirements of having widespread contamination, an imminent and substantial endangerment, and a delegated authority that isn't taking responsibility. They wrote a very terse letter back. It's on their website. You can Google US EPA Southeast Minnesota nitrates, and you'll see our petition, their letters, everything that came back. And they started out saying that drinking water contamination in the karst is an endangerment under the Safe Drinking Water Act that necessitates emergency action. We had petitioned them to take over the management, and they took a middle course. They came back to the state and said, here's the problem. It's laid out perfectly, reasonably. You know what the problem is, where the contamination's coming from. You have to do something. You're the delegated authority, you took on the responsibility, the state has to do it. The order said there's an evident need for further actions to preserve the public health, and they laid out with the chapter headings of the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was really that simple, that they went right back to the Safe Drinking Water Act that says you have to coordinate your efforts, you have to identify, count a census of how many people are impacted. You need that outreach and education, you need drinking water testing, you need alternative water supplies. You need communication with the public about all of these risks and tell us what you're doing. They said reply in 30 days. And we've been working on this for 4 years, and we see there's things that are critical. It's critical we have informed well owners. People need to know, and even with 30 years geology under my belt, I didn't realize that every well is different. Every well is different. It has different casing, a different horizon, a different water level, a different pump configuration. You cannot make broad brush statements about people's wells. They're as individual as everybody in this room. They need information about their water supply systems and how to operate and maintain them. It's amazing how many times people don't know exactly where their well is, or if it's safe or not. One of our clinics, I was showing a picture of a guy what a safe well looks like, sealed cap with a big gasket on it, 1.5 feet above the ground. And I said, "What's on your well?" And he said, "A bucket." So the Grundfos pump representative for our part of the state, I asked him, "What's the biggest warranty failure on residential pumps, new pumps?" Hair, mouse hair, falling down people's wells. That's not taking personal responsibility for your water supply. And it's harder to do than you think. Excuse the pun, it's a sunk cost. It's something that you think is there that's always going to be there. But there's a responsibility. But the same things that are critical are the same things that are missing. Just practical advice. We have a great set in the Midwest of well drillers and well service providers, but they're busy, and the calls that they get are out of water emergencies. I've had that happen with horses. I mean, you gotta have water. So it's not a learning moment for me, other than, can you fix it? We don't have good information. We don't even have a census of the wells. We don't know what the health statistics are among the people that drink that water, and we don't have the resources. The EPA ordered, besides those 7 specific things, a long-range planning. They said you must also develop and implement long-term solutions to have reductions in nitrates. But they left it up to the state to tell us what they're gonna do. There was no mandate. People say, oh, they're gonna come in and tell us what to do. That isn't the case at all. They said, you tell us what you're going to do, and we'll try to assist you. When I get on the conference calls with the US EPA, they're as serious as a heart attack. But their target is the state of Minnesota, not individual well owners. They want to help the individual well owners, and they want to make sure that the state is doing that too. That's the mandate. And it puts us into the realm of a risk assessment, and it's a pretty easy matrix for most risk assessments. What's the probability versus the consequences? And we're in a place now where we have high health consequences and high probability, and we need to move that through better well management, better testing, water treatment, down into those lower risk categories. But we don't even talk about the risk. And it gets back to the blame. When people think we're blaming them, they become defensive, and we can't talk about the solutions. We can't talk about the resources that are needed. But risk management, you have to first identify failures so that you don't repeat them. That's the principle of risk management. Strategic management is aspirational. Our SWCDs are full of aspiration. We're gonna do great things. Cover crops are gonna save us. All of these things, great aspirational, but they won't help somebody that has contaminated water at their kitchen sink today. Those efforts are gonna take a decade or a generation. And we need to advance them, accelerate them, do whatever we can to promote them, but the people that are drinking this bad water are at imminent health risk. So how do we communicate about it? I'm hoping we're not seeing signs like these on our wells.
Do you have a wow?
I'm almost done.
Okay, cool.
They expect to hold sources responsible. And given the urgency, we want a response in 30 days. The deadline was last week. I'm happy with the state's response. It's less than we hoped for, but it's more than we expected. It's gonna take money, it's gonna take resources, it's gonna take all those things, coordination, communication, testing. It's gonna take all of those things. And we have to assess who's responsible and who can manage the risk. We have to know who can help with this. And if you look at how widespread the problem is, the red, orange nitrates across the country, this isn't just southeastern Minnesota karst. This is in many places across the country. But I started off saying, who cares? Who cares? We found 11 partners who cared enough to put together the petition and put all our work together using government data to prove the trajectory is not improving our health outcomes. There's a lot of great people in these organizations that have come together and helped, and they're the same people that are helping with our water clinics. They're coming out and helping to serve the community to make sure we have safe water. But who else cares? US EPA cares. They turned around this letter we sent in April. They got back to us in November and said, yeah, you're right. It's not the glacial speed of government. It was lightning fast, and they said it's an imminent risk. And Minnesota has complicated water management. We have all those agencies dealing with water. They only cited the ones in red: Pollution Control Agency, Department of Agriculture. But it's people that care. And I'll end with this. We've changed the narrative in our in our clinics to say we only care about your water at your kitchen sink, but bring your friends and neighbors' water. It's free to everybody. We'll do it while you wait and give you the nitrate tests. And did that in St. Charles on Groundhog's Day this year, and a local dairy farmer that I knew came in and he had 3 samples. And I said, Gary, you know what your water is. You're grade A dairy. You test it all the time. He said, yeah, but I'm worried about those 2 little girls across the street. I want to make sure their water's safe. People care. Thank you.
Well, our next speaker cues up his presentation. I'll do a slow walk through his introduction. When I read the news about what's happening in Minnesota, I thought, being from Dubuque, we have a river and we got a political boundary to 2 states, less than a mile away. This is a problem in Minnesota. It's hard to believe that the Mississippi River or a political boundary would keep that problem out of Iowa or Wisconsin. So I wanted to ask, what is the assessment for Iowa? What is the risk for Northeast Iowa? Dubuque and Jackson County are at the lower end of the Driftless. We're part of it. I invited legislators and public officials from 7 counties, Alameda, Winneshiek, Clayton, Fayette, Delaware, Dubuque, Jackson, all counties that are in great part included in that area, but others on the fringes as well. We have a resource in Iowa who has done some work in this area, so we're lucky to have David Twertney here today from the University of Iowa Center on the Health Effects of Environmental Contamination, which for me is really the perfect spot that I want to be in terms of my knowledge, not just what are the environmental risks in the area, in the state, but what are the health risks associated with those environmental risks. And they've been doing some work up in this neck of the woods. Not all of it is ready for prime time, I understand. Maybe he'll tell you a little bit about that. That's why you want to put your email address on, because when that information comes out, we'll make sure you get it. But we have some great assets at our universities in Iowa, and they made themselves available to work with us in Northeast Iowa and talk to us tonight. So David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this on? Oh, how about now? Better? Hopefully better? If not, okay, I'll just project. I'll do my best to be, there it is. Hey, bingo. All right. Thank you, Chuck. We're, just to make sure we have ample time for discussion, I might go a little more quickly through this than I planned, but there's a few things that probably don't need to get discussed with that great primer. Representative Eisenhart basically asked me to say, what do we know about what's going on up here in the Driftless? And so we are doing a lot of research up in this area. Some of it is much more forward-looking than probably the current conversation. I think everything that's happening in Minnesota, thinking about nitrogen and nitrate, I wanted to focus on that primarily. So that's what will be the focus of my talk. If you're unfamiliar with who the Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contamination are, we are a state-funded research center that was founded in 1987 through the Groundwater Protection Act. We do work that is really trying to better understand how the environment impacts public health. We have our own laboratory. We're doing testing. We're going to be rolling out a program where we're doing reduced cost-free testing on a variety of things, so stay tuned. We get a lot of requests. We do our best, but we're a fairly small outfit, but trying to make the most with the resources we have from the state. We have done a tremendous amount of research before my time even at Cheek, focused on private wells. And so the people before me conducted things like the Iowa statewide rural water, well water survey. It gets referred to as SWIRL. You'll see that we've been doing a bunch more, a lot focused up here in Northeast Iowa. Like I said, I'm not gonna talk about issues like PFAS and pesticides, maybe things you've heard about. Happy to take questions on those afterwards if you have them. But we have a lot of our focus on private wells for all the reasons that were just explained, that well owners are basically outside Safe Drinking Water Act and more or less on their own when it comes to ensuring the safety of their water supply. So one of the things, I heard some discussion leading up to this about access to data. So we do have good data. I'll talk more about this. There's some limitations to it, but we have what's known as the private well tracking system. If you've ever had your well tested through your county public health office, there is a program in Iowa called the Grants to Counties program that makes that testing at low cost or no cost available to you. All of that data goes into what's known as the PWTS, the Private Well Tracking System. It is an abysmal interface for the average person to get there, to pull up on their computer and try to access. One of the things we've been trying to do is make this information more readily available. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to Google, the Iowa Well Forecasting System. We actually did this in partnership with the Iowa Geological Survey. It contains information not only about where the bedrock aquifers are located across the state of Iowa, but you will be able to pull up additional information about well water quality data. I'd be happy to talk more about this. It's maybe not the most intuitive site for people to work through, but reach out if you're interested and we can talk more about how to make that information accessible to you all. We've also looked at the effectiveness of that Grants to Counties program. So this Grants to Counties program was also started through the Groundwater Protection Act. There are funds that go to each county in the state every year. It's usually somewhere between $30,000 to $50,000, depending each year. That money can be used on three things. Well testing, for anything that has an EPA standard or health advisory. It can be used to plug abandoned wells or rehabilitate damaged wells. And so we looked at the effectiveness of expenditures in this program. This was back in about 2019. And one of the things that's great about you all up here in Northeast Iowa is you were heavily engaged in this program. So what this map is looking at is what percentage of the expenditures that go to counties that gets used through the Grants to Counties program. And so if your county is in green, and you see most of Northwest Iowa is, you're using all of your funds and then some. Meaning that your public health sanitarians, the environmental specialists, they're out working in the community to make sure they get wells tested, they plug those abandoned wells, they rehabilitate those damaged wells. I'll say that Dubuque had been a little bit behind, but they are doing much better since this report came out, which is great to see. I don't need to spend time on karst. I think part of the reason people are as engaged as they are in this part of Iowa is because they know their wells are vulnerable. And I think we just heard an excellent talk as to why. So let's talk about what we know about the water quality in the karst region. And the most definitive study that's been done is actually not by us, which is fine, but out of Wisconsin. Perhaps you've heard of the Southwest Wisconsin well survey study. This was conducted by Mark Borchardt, who's a scientist with the USDA. And essentially, counties paid for this work. They were finding high levels of contamination in their wells, and they wanted to know where that contamination was coming from. And you can imagine that there was essentially two prevalent hypotheses. One was that it could be coming from the land use in agriculture because there was particularly cattle that was being raised in Southwest Wisconsin. But the other side of the argument is septic systems. And so I want to talk about that too, because I think it's important to account for both possible sources when we're thinking about the vulnerabilities to wells. You can access this final report in the state of Wisconsin here. I'm happy to make these slides available to anybody who's interested. Just let me know. And I'll try to give you a quick summary of that report. So the first thing is they tested 840 water samples over the course of this study in Southwest Wisconsin. They looked for the contaminants that we tended to focus on historically through our Grants to Counties program testing, which was nitrate, total coliform bacteria, and E. coli. Total coliform is what we call an indicator bacteria. It's not particularly harmful from a public health perspective, but if we find that in a water sample, that means your well's it's compromised. There's access to outside water that could be contaminating your well. If you're ending up with E. coli, that's what we sometimes refer to as fecal coliform. It's indication of fecal contamination. So in Southwest Wisconsin, where they have that same karst topography, 42% of the wells in their November sampling and 27% of their wells in the April sampling were positive for total coliform bacteria and or nitrate above the US EPA MCL. The nitrate drinking water standard, you may be aware, is 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. These percentages in the karst regions of Wisconsin are well above the statewide average, consistent with wells and karst being far more susceptible to these forms of contamination. So the next question, and that's what makes this study unique. Where is the contamination coming from? So what Dr. Borchardt's lab can do is measure specific characteristics of bacteria and pathogens they encounter and determine, does that pathogen come from human waste, such as a leaky septic system, or does it come from a cow, as might be from land spread manure? And effectively what they found is it's a little bit of both. That they tested 138 wells to do what we call source tracking. 64 wells came back with evidence of human wastewater, 33 wells with cattle manure, and 13 wells with pig manure. So in this region of Southwest Wisconsin, it's not just CAFOs and manure that's an issue, it's our septic systems as well. And if you run the math, and that's what I like about Dr. Borchardt's talk, it makes some intuitive sense. That if you think about, and this is one of the counties that was done actually before the official Southwest Wisconsin study, you can run the numbers and see that there's about 1.74 times 10 to the 9th liters of cattle manure every year that's spread on land in Kewaunee County. But if you compare that to the amount of septic effluent that's being discharged to the subsurface, given the use of septics in the area, it's not all that far off, 6.8 times 10 to the 8th, which is pretty close. So when we think about where there's discharges of pathogens and bacteria into the environment, it's not one or the other, it's both. I won't go into all the details, but you can check out this report, and one of the other things they did was think about vulnerability or risk factors for wells. So if you're thinking about wells and geology, if you're worried about nitrate contamination, you're more vulnerable if your well is older, your casing depth is shallower, your casing length to bedrock is shorter, your well depth is shallower, your geology is fractured or sand and gravel. So you can take a look at this, and if you know this information about your well, you can start to assess your vulnerability. One of the messages you'll hear from me is we often don't know enough about our wells. I think we heard that from the prior speaker as well. So learning about your wells to understand where you might fit into these categories for nitrate contamination, bacterial contamination, it's good to know the more you know. The other bit is thinking about risk factors from land use. And so in the study in Southwest Wisconsin, nitrate was correlated with large amounts of cultivated land area nearby, livestock farms that are closer, but human wastewater, we worry about septic systems that have a high count nearby or are closer in terms of their location, which makes some intuitive sense. So what does all this mean for Northeast Iowa? What I would say is you could get your counties to pay for similar studies. We are developing the capabilities where we could do such testing in our lab, including the source tracking, or you could work with Dr. Borkhardt's lab in Wisconsin. But what I would tell you is it's probably reasonable to expect comparable findings here. We have similar land use, we have similar well and geology and septic system distribution. I think it's a reasonable starting point to think about where are our problems coming from. May not always be the case. It may be more of one influence than other depending on a location, but I don't think it's going to be this cut and dry, always this source of contamination versus always that. And I agree with the prior speaker, talking about the quality of the water at the tap is more important than it is about necessarily pointing fingers and laying blame. So let's look at data in Iowa then. We've heard a lot about Minnesota, we've now talked about Wisconsin. What does the information actually show for Iowa? This is the private well tracking system. If you go to DNR's website, this is what greets you. We are, though, better than most because we have this data that we've been collecting since the inception of this program. What I'm showing you here is all the nitrate testing results from 1990 to today, 2023, from the private well tracking system, and just for these select 10 counties, Alameda, Clayton, Winneshiek, well, you can read. Not all of them. A couple things. What's the first thing that jumps out to you on that plot?
2015.
2015. What the heck happened in 2015? One of the problems with this data is there can be issues with how the data gets entered in. When I talk about the nitrate drinking water standard, I say it's 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. This year, and from about 2014 and 2015, the data was not entered with that pesky as nitrogen. It was entered in another form where it was just nitrate as nitrate. I don't expect you to understand why that matters, but there's about a factor of 4.5 in a difference. So take all these numbers and divide them by 4.5. That's what you would do. One of the problems we have with PWTS, and I know folks want to use PWTS to try to understand where we have contamination. You have to be careful about it because there are quirks in the data just like that. The other issue, some of the data has clearly been misentered. We find wells that are way too old, that say they were, I know there are old wells in Iowa, but clearly when you think of age and depth, it's clear some of that data is not getting introduced or introed correctly. So what we've been trying to do is break this down and basically ignore 2014 to 2015 because that's going to skew a lot of our analysis. And you see this in the counties. Here's Clayton County's data. This is a pretty good, robust bit of data collection, particularly from 2000 on, so kudos to Clayton County. But you see how 2014 and 2015 jump out because the data was just entered using a different unit. Okay, now, so what have we tried to do? What I'm showing you here are those same 10 counties, Alameda, Bremer, well, again, you can read. In blue, I'm showing you the results of nitrate prior to 2013. we're going to ignore 2014 and 2015 data, and in red I'm showing you data after 2016. I'm showing you the percent of testing results that come in above that EPA MCL. So what percentage of well tests are producing unsafe water? I'll give you a second to identify your county, and then I want to talk a little bit about the trends that we see. First, there are some counties like Delaware and Clayton and Dubuque with the limited data we had pre-2013. These are very high percentages. I don't know the percentages in Minnesota off the top of my head that were talked about in their petition, but I believe these are comparable or probably maybe even a little higher. I would caution not to make too much about trends like here in Allamakee of really high to really low. Because what's the point of the testing program? It's for people to figure out their water's contaminated and perhaps put a treatment system in, perhaps plug that well, perhaps find an alternative supply. So this may not mean, and it probably doesn't mean, that our water quality is getting better. It means, if anything, that the program is working because well users are getting more informed and they're not continuing to test their contaminated well. They're likely off to, hopefully, a better water quality supply. So this is useful, but we got to be careful about how much we want to interpret it. But clearly, we have some wells in karst areas that are very vulnerable. I'll talk in a bit about why we also are interested in nitrate results between 5 and 10 milligrams per liter. That EPA standard is 10. I'll talk to you in a moment about why that standard may not be protective enough, and 5 might be a better number for us to be thinking about. Similar types of trends that we see, significant results that are coming in this 5 to 10 range, which also in the context of how water quality might change from year to year, speaks to wells that would be vulnerable to potentially being higher than 10, and if we believe some of the science that says 5 to 10 may be also causing health problems, these are well consumers that are also at risk. What we're doing now is another limitation in the private well tracking system is it might give us a depth, but we really don't know much about necessarily which aquifer is being sourced. And so we've been working with the Iowa Geological Survey and Rick Langle, who has actually taken these 20 counties now, we've expanded it, and he's gone through and he has looked at a variety of data in PWTS, he's talked to well drillers, he's using his local knowledge, and we're trying to start to identify and assign wells to aquifers. So we can start to think about which aquifers have quality problems, not just which wells. Because you can have two wells next to each other, and if one is drawing from a much deeper well and another one's a much shallower well, one could be perfectly fine and one could be contaminated. And it doesn't matter that they're close to each other or in the same county. What matters is they're tapping the same aquifer. So this is still a work in progress, but it gives you a different way to look at the data. Again, we're just looking on these most recent years, and we're beginning to think about, again, here it is in counties, and if you care about the counties, the highest median nitrate, so median means half the data is below it, half the data is above it. We're looking at Clayton and Jackson. The highest mean or average nitrate concentrations, again, are Clayton and Delaware. So Clayton is a county. We definitely see these high nitrate levels. This is what that looks like on a map. If you're interested in seeing just how much that data looks geographically and spatially, again, we're looking in that period before Dubuque had a lot of data, so it's this not there. But on the left is nitrate, green is what we call safe, 0 to 5, yellow is where we urge caution from 5 to 10, and above 10 is unsafe. And then I'm showing you total coliform on the right, which is just safe if there's no coliform present, unsafe if there's coliform present. It's a large amount of data. It can be difficult to work with. This is now what all of that data looks like when we start to assign it to the different aquifers: alluvial, berry, sand, and gravel, Devonian, Silurian, Maquoketa, Galena, Jordan, and Cambrian. And you see what I mean about you might be close to a neighbor that has a well, but you could be tapping a completely different aquifer, and you should reasonably expect completely different chemistries and water quality. Now, this is the analysis we're really needing to do and dig into, is let's look at different aquifers and say nitrate levels. And so we do tend to see these are box and whisker plots that are showing this is the median here, and that's like the 75th percentile, 25th, and then I think like 10th and 90th. And anyways, this is just showing you the range of data. The higher these boxes are, the higher the average values. We know our alluvial wells are more vulnerable to high nitrate. We're seeing that. And we're beginning to understand some of the other aquifers that might be more susceptible. This might look more appealing on a map. So we could take nitrate and we can look at all the wells in these counties that are buried sand and gravel wells. And you see pockets like up here where you have this 5 to 10 level of nitrate. But now if you look at Silurian wells right here, and now of course that in front of you all, I'm blanking on which county this is. Delaware, thank you. Delaware has a lot of unsafe levels of nitrate that's being drawn from Silurian wells. That's information we need to better understand what's going on in the Silurian, to better inform community of people who are drilling new wells, what they're getting into if they're tapping the Silurian. But it's not all wells there, right? There's some good ones, and so we're beginning to dig into this. Is it the depth inside the Silurian well, the aquifer that matters? Is it proximity to karst? Is it proximity to CAFOs? There's other factors that would add on top of that. And then similar things with E. coli now, fecal coliform, buried sand and gravel versus Silurian. You can't see all the red here, but it's a similar story because it's buried behind more of the safe readings that we're getting. So this is the level of analysis we're trying to do so we can better understand where we have vulnerabilities in our underground water. What I'd like to end on real quickly with the last few minutes, and then hopefully we'll have ample time for discussion. Why should we care from a public health standpoint? And so you may not know, but there's a great report put out every year by the Iowa Cancer Registry. These are estimates for new cancer cases in 2023 by county. But the most important message that's come out of this report is right now Iowa ranks second in the United States in cancer incidence. And we are the only state that has seen a significant increase in cancer incidence from 2015 to 2019. If you think about what we regulate our water for potential cancer-causing agents, these are the things in the Safe Drinking Water Act that are listed under regulations for increasing the risk of cancer. I've highlighted in green the ones that are most relevant to Iowa, because most people want to jump to this idea that the environment is contributing to this. There's things like radium and uranium. We have these naturally occurring in some of our aquifers. Arsenic, we know, is a problem. If you're on a centralized water system, you have to worry about byproducts of disinfection, and allichlor is an herbicide. Not listed on that list is nitrate. We regulate nitrate at 10 milligrams per liter as N because of its ability to interfere with oxygen transport in the body. It's methemoglobinemia, or blue baby syndrome, that if an infant is drinking water contaminated with nitrate above 10 milligrams per liter, they become oxygen deprived. They turn blue. And it's because the way the nitrate gets transformed in the body to interact with hemoglobin, which transports oxygen. There's emerging evidence that nitrate in drinking water might have other effects, like chronic effects like cancer. The links between cancer and nitrate are well understood because of nitrate from food. Many of you are aware of nitrite and nitrate in things like bacon and the risks that's listed as potentially increasing risk to cancer. What hasn't normally been paid attention to is nitrate in drinking water. But a lot of work's been done here in Iowa, including some work by my center before I was the director, that has shown a variety of increased risks of bladder cancer, ovarian cancer, thyroid cancer, to extended exposure to nitrate in drinking water. And a lot of this is happening below 10 milligrams per liter, which is the current standard. 5, 3, 5, and not over 30 to 100 years, but 4, 11, or 5 years of exposure. If you're pregnant, there's also been associations through epidemiological studies with birth defects above 5, spina bifida, limb deficiencies, cleft palate. We don't regulate nitrate in drinking water for any of these chronic effects. We have lots of Iowans, not just those on private wells, but those on public supplies. Probably about 800,000 Iowans on public water supplies that see 5 milligrams per liter or higher nitrate in their water every year. There's a study going on in Nebraska right now that's looking at causal links potential links between nitrate in well water and childhood cancers. Right now, those results those studies are showing associations with atrazine, a corn herbicide, and nitrate in drinking water with increased incidence of childhood cancer in some communities. We need to be paying attention to this study. You may be wondering where the EPA is at on this. They actually, back in 2017, initiated a new health assessment to see if nitrate in drinking water could be a cancer risk. It was paused in 2019 in the last administration. It was not listed or viewed as an agency priority to assess nitrate's effect as a cancer-causing agent in drinking water. Good news that this has finally restarted in October of 2023. And this is the first step of trying to understand if the EPA should more stringently regulate nitrate in drinking water below 10 to account for these chronic health effects. So to conclude and then have time for questions, we listed some recommendations in this brief that I did with my colleague Sylvia Secchi on the Grants to Counties program. We've checked this has happened, expanded testing. It used to be nitrate, E. coli, arsenic. Now it's anything that has an EPA MCL or a health standard, so PFAS, you name it, there's opportunities to get that covered. We need to figure out how to better prioritize vulnerable wells. That's why we're working at the aquifer level to try to understand where those vulnerabilities are. We need, I'll say this again in a moment, money to support homeowners that want to buy treatment. I'm envious of your $300 or $600 RO system. Well, I bought one for somebody and it was $1,400 to install and about $300 every year to replace cartridges. That's a burden. We need to improve marketing of the Grants to Counties program, although you all do very well with that up here. And we need to improve an inventory. We need the census that was just discussed. Our estimates are somewhere probably around 100,000 to 200,000 wells in Iowa. We have two databases. One has about 90,000, the other has about 100,000. They don't always line up. That's why I end up at about 150. So if you're a well owner, what can you do? And then I'll shut up. Stay engaged. It's great you're here. Keep testing. Even if you've tested before, water quality can change. Learn about your well. Get a well driller out to come and inspect it. Have them tell you about it. Don't just give the answer that it's been in the family. It's always been, we think it's been safe, we'll keep using it. Advocate for change. I'm not asking you to advocate necessarily for how we, ag versus non. Little things like we should be putting funding to helping people buy treatment systems. The Grants to Counties program could be expanded easily to do that and help people. Nebraska is doing this now in high nitrate areas. If Nebraska can do it, we can do it. There's no reason we can't. If you use a point of use or point of entry treatment technology, make sure it's designed to remove the thing you think it's removing. And there are certifying agencies out there like NSF and ANSI that will say, we've tested this to remove that. Buy those to make sure you're getting something that works. And then maintain your device as recommended. And then know your vulnerabilities. Think about septics, yours, your neighbors. Think about nearby land use practices. I'm happy, like I said, happy to share slides, happy to answer questions even after this event. We get lots of requests at Cheek. This is my information. Please check me out. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion, hopefully.
I'm going to ask the first question in a minute. Come on back up. Hopefully it's a brief one, but think about the questions you want to ask. We have till 8 o'clock or until we're kicked out. So I wanted to bring your attention very briefly to a handout I had in the back. You're wondering what your state legislature may be doing. This is not, I can say, a top of mind issue. I think that's safe to say in the state legislature, although there have been discussions around what we do, and there's certainly conversations, but as far as making it a priority for legislative action, in recent years that has not been there. But we kind of like anniversaries, so maybe the 50th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act might be a good theme that we could put together a package of proposals to at least talk about. And some of them may be on this list. I've worked with David and others over the years on bringing up what I consider pretty modest proposals. One of them on here, and I have some of the bills that I introduced this year. I can just mention a couple for your. We have a requirement if you're selling your property, if it has a septic, that the septic has to be inspected, and buyer is informed about those results. We don't have a similar requirement for a drinking water well. Seems to me kind of a no-brainer. Why don't we require that testing at least when the property is being sold? Another piece of legislation I introduced, we've had some discussions about it with Chief in the past. There's tremendous amount of federal resources coming down the pike for infrastructure. A lot of it's clean water related through our state drinking water revolving fund. The federal government is gonna be coming down, and maybe they have come down the pike with some requirements for testing of lead and copper in public drinking water supplies. A bill that I've introduced is, why don't we get a head start on that? Start requiring testing of lead, copper, PFAS, and other things, at least in schools or childcare centers, where we know vulnerable people already are. So we have the resources to do that. We need to find a way, I think, to focus on some of those issues. There may be others on here that trip your trigger. The other thing I wanted to bring to you is on the back, an outline. Actually, it's not an outline, it is in fact the legislative language that I offered as an amendment to a bill last year. It'll be introduced as a bill this year. There are some regions of the state that have unique geological features and vulnerabilities that have led in the past the state to create what we call conservation and development authorities to help address. Many people here may be familiar with the Les Hills. There is a Les Hills Conservation and Development Authority that involves the counties in that geographic area to help them get the resources they need to address the unique issues that they have in that region. There's also a Southern Iowa Conservation and Development Authority, and we allow them to form. It's not a mandatory thing, but the counties in those regions can form into this authority. They can create a fund that then the state legislature and other sources of funding can contribute to help you address some of the unique issues in your area. I can promise you that this bill will not go anywhere unless the counties in the Driftless area, Fayette County, Clayton, Alameda, Winneshiek, talk among themselves and say, we think this would be a useful tool. So I mentioned that to you tonight just as maybe a discussion starter. If you're getting together anytime soon with your colleagues in this area, maybe do some research of your own. Think about whether this or not might be a tool that would be useful to you. Then get a hold of your representative, Representative Osmondson, among others. And maybe at some point in the future, we would have a discussion in Des Moines about whether this is a bill that we could co-sponsor and maybe move forward together. So there are things we can do. We're interested in hearing more about your ideas. If we run out of time tonight, I will be heading over to the tavern across the river in Prairie du Chien, where I'd be happy to buy a drink for anybody who doesn't have far to drive or might be staying over. And we can talk about some of these issues further. At this point, I wanted to ask our speakers as the first question, how much of what we see in northeast Iowa and southeast Wisconsin make this area of the state more vulnerable and therefore maybe more in need of attention from state folks or even our federal legislative delegation? Why should we focus on what's happening here versus what's happening elsewhere? And do I need to convince the guy sitting next to me in the legislature, Josh Turk at Council Bluffs, that he should care about what's happening here?
In Minnesota, geologists and hydrologists have broken the state down into 6 hydrogeographic regions where they have similar geology, similar aquifers, and similar risks. But you've hit on one of the things where we've been criticized for our petition. We've only addressed the karst. Our central sands has as bad a problem. Our area with the Des Moines Till has a worse problem with arsenic. So we've gone back to the states and said, be bold. The US EPA said, do this here, but it needs to be the whole state of Minnesota. Don't leave everybody else behind. We did this as a matter of self-preservation where we live, but clean water affects everybody. So knowing those risks in the geologic terrain, and you laid it out, well depth, aquifer, we, all of the states in the driftless area, we know those things, and we can assess the risk.
Yeah, and I'd say all private wells in Iowa have a vulnerability of contamination. Alluvial wells, the shallower ones, older, we tend to find, it may not always be nitrate and bacteria, it could be other things, it often is nitrate and bacteria. So while this is a place to prioritize given some unique vulnerabilities, it doesn't mean that you can't benefit other well users in the state. And if you go deeper, if you drill deeper wells here, you run into those things like uranium, arsenic, manganese, radium. Things like radium and uranium are cancer-causing agents. We find those when we look for them in deeper wells. We should be helping all well users get access to clean water. But if we put a prioritization in place because we don't want to put the necessary resources towards it, then I would probably start here because this is where there's some of the greatest need. In a perfect world, we put enough resources where we could help everybody. So I feel like it's, we spend a lot of time in Iowa thinking about who's most vulnerable. It'd be nice if we didn't have to take all the vulnerable people and categorize only those as worthy of getting action.
David, is there more that the Iowa DNR or Department of Public Health could be doing?
So I'll say a couple things. I think so.
I don't want to get you in trouble.
No, and I won't speak in a way that would get me in trouble. I've told you, I think the Grants Counties program is a great resource and we could do more with it. Well rehabilitation only gets you so far if your well water's contaminated. That I would like to see more flexibility, and even if it's just some grant up front to help offset cost of acquisition of a treatment system, I think that makes a lot of sense. Especially if there's more revenue going into that program. That would be a simple change, and that would come through Health and Human Services now, I think is what it's called, right? It used to be IDPH. At DNR, I am a huge advocate for more monitoring, not less. And so I would like to see more testing, surface waters, well water. I'd like to see resources go towards helping counties market and advertise the program. I'd like to see more money going to counties so they can get more personnel and staff. I mean, it does come down to some things like resources. But on monitoring, that's something that I think DNR could do more of. I would also say making the data more easily accessible for the general public. PWTS is very difficult to access. We have an ambient groundwater monitoring data set. I don't think the average public would be able to access it. We could use what we know about our aquifers through things like the ambient groundwater monitoring program. If we can start assigning private wells to aquifers to start predicting where there's risk, right? So it's all about making data accessible through visualizations that average folks can understand. Like that could be done, and that would be incredibly helpful.
I'd like to comment on that too. In Minnesota, the thing that we're really after is to deal with this as an immediate health risk and separate that from the conservation program that's a decade or generation. These are two different things. We have to treat them separately. People are at risk at their homes, at their kitchen sink now. And we can do all these aspirational things, and most of that comes from public health communication. I'm a geologist, I'm not a public health official. And in Minnesota, we have all these different agencies dealing with water. I don't want my health advice from the ag department. I don't. I want it from the health department. And they're the people dealing with the immediacy of the risk. So that's our big ask. But the data issue is huge. This is really, to do these assessments is a big data issue. Minnesota Well Index put into place 1974 DOS-based program that's no longer supported. There's nobody there that can run the program anymore. And we haven't kept up. So there's just the census of who's drinking the water. Knowing how many wells, how many affected parties. That was the number 2 thing US EPA asked for. You guys don't have it. How can you manage this? So there's some big data needs. It's gonna cost some money. There's people that have done an amazing job with little or no money. Olmsted County counted all of their wells under their hazard mitigation plan. They said, if we have a leak or a spill, we need to know to alert people. And it took them, some are interns for 3 years, but it got done and it's 98% complete. So there's models all over, but we're not coordinated. We're off in all of these different directions.
So the last thing that triggered something that I want to make sure, we need to talk about nitrate differently in this state. We talk to a lot of well users and they'll say, I'm not worried about my nitrate even when it's 20 because I don't have a baby or a pregnant mother to be in the house. That ignores all of this other new emerging data that it's you know, even if you're drinking 20, like those risks that might be there at 5 that I was talking about, they're definitely there at 22, right? The state of Wisconsin has a wonderful fact sheet that makes the point that nitrate affects everybody. It's not just Blue Baby anymore. We don't talk about it that way. So we have a lot of people who think, if I don't have a child, I don't need to worry about it. That is wrong. That is wrong. That there are health effects that we need to be thinking about below, even at 10, but below potentially even, right? It's not just a Blue Baby thing anymore. And I think that would, if we could talk about it differently, we'd get people wanting to be more proactive in addressing the problem.
In Minnesota, the nitrate testing has been related to pesticide too. The health department or the ag department found that if you had 3 parts per million nitrates, there was a 90% probability of 1 or more pesticides. If you were at 10, there was a 96% probability of 6 or more pesticides. And we don't talk about the cocktail. They've started talking about that in Nebraska. You've seen the data probably where they're linking different chemicals with health risks. But people ask us, what should we do about the pesticides? And it's really easy. You treat for it. It costs more to test for pesticides than it does to treat it. An activated carbon filter will take out those pesticides. It's the standard. So we tell people, if you're worried about that, get the carbon filter. And my little treatment system has a pre-sediment filter, a carbon filter, a reverse osmosis, and a post-carbon filter. So it costs me $1 a day to run it. That's affordable. So, I mean, there's solutions.
Maybe a broad question for both of you, but I grew up on a farm, small family farm in north central Iowa in the 60s and 70s. And I've seen, like everybody else, a dramatic change in agricultural practices. And it probably doesn't escape anybody that what we're doing to the land is resulting in what we're talking about today, a direct correlation. I guess part of my question is, and I've heard this a comeback from a couple of legislators about this when they say, well, yeah, but we weren't testing for health effects like back in the 60s and 70s like we are now. So how do we know it's any different than it was then? And I'm kind of at a loss for a good response to that, because it makes common sense. If we've seen a tripling or quadrupling of the amount of pesticides and fertilizers we're putting on our ground, which and combined with the dramatic increase in pattern tiling across the state, something like 40,000 miles of this stuff every year in the state of Iowa. It's just like this in Minnesota. We've got direct conduits going into our water systems. So what's a viable response to someone who says, well, we weren't testing back then for health effects like we are now?
And
You go first,
it's test your water.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power here. I
Right.
mean, if you know, and you can find out what that is, that's the key. There's a lot of funny narratives about this. For instance, we have a legislature that keeps saying, well, there's no Blue Baby syndromes.
Right.
What's the problem? Well, that was one of the best public health successes in the last 50 years. There isn't a neonatal care, a WIC person, an advisor to pregnant women that doesn't tell them, make sure you have safe water. We have totally prevented Blue Baby syndrome in the same time our water is getting worse.
Yeah.
But we're gonna need to do it forever.
Yeah. Right.
It's not ending. And these new statistics out of Nebraska are really scary. There's a cluster of counties where 1 in 12 kids are born with birth defects. Everybody you know. That's motivated the legislature to go back and fund testing and reverse osmosis. They've got IRA funds to put in reverse osmosis and give people a $4,000 credit if you have more than 10 parts per million. They're concerned about the public health. They know people care.
So I answer that question by saying, to start, that we talk a lot in Iowa about how we're #1 in all these agricultural metrics. And to me, as a scientist, I would say, why would we think we can have such a unique production system and not have unique consequences that we need to stay on top of? And that's what leads to, first, I would say, more monitoring, not less. That is my mantra at Cheek. We need to test more because we don't know. We should figure it out. And that is not, again, it's not a knock on anything about where it's coming from. It's like, let's figure out what the risks are first.
Yeah.
Second, that cancer report has got a lot of folks at the University of Iowa working, because that is recent data.
Yeah.
We're the only state increasing year on year. I think it was 2010 to 2015 were the years. That's not old data.
Yeah.
Before we were monitoring. That's new. Now I want to be careful, and I want to be we cannot jump to some conclusion that it's the environment. But take the first thing I said, we should want to know that it's not the environment, which means we need to study it. We need to look at co-exposures. We need to understand nitrate as a potential source. For what it's worth, we see, it's not that we have cancer cases that are spiking in unique ways that we don't see in other states. There are a few. What tends to be, particularly on things that get associated with nitrate, we're not declining as fast as other states. Other states are improving their cancer incidence better than we are. Something is causing us to lag.
Right.
And again, we should want to know, we should want to be certain it's not the environment. And again, there's no reason I would think we could have a unique production system that wouldn't come without unique consequences. So that's my take on that. And I try to do it, me personally have my feelings about what we should be doing differently on the land, but just as thinking about this issue and the data, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Right there, and then we can go back.
You mentioned the Iowa well forecasting system. Would I be able, with my well, it's 53 feet deep and was put in the early 80s, would I be able to see which aquifer I was getting my water from, or what data would I?
Most likely. It depends on if you're in the system to begin with. Do you know if you've tested and, okay.
Test Catherine Miller.
Yeah, and so the best thing you can do in that situation is sort of look at locations around you, and there are ways in there, you can't click on an active well and have it tell you what aquifer it's in. You could drop a pin right next to that well, and then it would tell you what aquifers are there at that depth, if that makes sense. We did not go through and assign aquifers to individual wells because that's a lot of work. But what we did do is if you could put a pin anywhere on a map, and then it will tell you where the depths are of the different aquifers you could draw from. You could probably look at the depth of your well, look at the depths of the aquifers in the area, and make a pretty good guess. But it may not be a perfect guess, though.
And
That's
I
the
could just
challenge.
Google that on the Iowa well
Yep.
forecasting
And
system.
honestly, I'd be happy to send me a question. My email should be up there. If you have any issues with it, I'd happily try to help you navigate
I
it.
don't have email, so I can call you.
Okay, just call me. That's my office phone. You would get me. Then next to you, and then
Question, it seems like a lot of the data you have relies on the Clean Water Act, and I was wondering what sort of, since it's under attack somewhat, what is the political appetite for keeping it all going?
Political appetite for keeping the data collection going, or the grants?
Well, yeah,
All
I
of it?
mean, with the Clean Water Act, is it gonna stay or is it gonna go or what?
So the Clean Water Act regulates surface waters. It's
Yeah.
not what regulates drinking water. So what the Clean Water Act regulates is discharges out of well-defined sources that we call point sources, like a wastewater effluent. It won't go away. I mean, it can get enforced at different levels. I think what's most important in the state, in any state, is the level of enforcement. And so, what's the appetite? Some states enforce it more strictly than others. And there are big holes in the Clean Water Act, as many of you might know, that it doesn't regulate diffuse pollution or what we call non-point source pollution, so pollution that runs off land.
Yeah.
And that ends up being most of where our pollution comes from, particularly for nutrients, because we have permits that require wastewater plants to discharge only a certain amount of nutrients. We don't have similar limits on what comes off land. So it's not so much that the law would go away, it's that we will enforce it to varying levels of extents in different states, depending on, well, a lot of reasons.
And if I could address that for the Safe Drinking Water Act is probably different. I think that's becoming more robust over time. It was originally passed in '74 with only the list of chemicals to test for. In '86, they put in more details about how you communicate those things. And in the '90s, it was updated again, and now they're talking about updating the list of chemicals that are tested for to add these new emergence chemicals, the PFAS chemicals and the pharmaceuticals and things to the list that have established health concerns. After Flint, I don't see the Safe Drinking Water Act going away.
If I could jump in here really quick, about how many people still have questions?
Cause we're at
1, 2, 3, 4. Sure. If you can limit your question to a minute, maybe a minute response for each. we should
That's
be
why I'm
able to
trying to
get done
buzz
here.
through them. So, Red Squareback.
I'm grateful for the work that you're doing. There's a part of this that I'm either not hearing or it's missing, and that is the translation from the point where a person gets more information, gets more data, and the place where there's something actionable that moves us closer to a point. What if we were to suppose that citizens had a right to access to clean water? What has happened, what's your experience as these people who've come and been tested, and they have knowledge of the degree of their contamination? I'm concerned if it becomes too individuated, that people say, well, that's my problem, how much is it gonna cost me to fix
Right.
my source?
Yeah.
Versus something larger. And so for those areas where you've been doing this good work, I'd be interested in your observation. Has the climate changed the appetite of citizens to apply pressure, or pressure needs to be provided in order to change the political and legal culture to assure that these are not individually experienced expenses and anxieties and are viewed as a collective need to change the practices that cause the pollution to begin with?
You've hit on a series of really important things about communication and action. And our little planning during COVID really taught us about what we call the attention economy. You know, New York Times article last week said the average attention span now is like 47 seconds. But when you have somebody's attention, you have to make it actionable. Put it on a calendar. Give them something to do. Inform them. So this is a big part of the clinics that we put on. We always have consultants, mostly retired geologists, hydrologists, that sit down and talk with people. But we've noticed this exact thing. We had a clinic up in the St. Croix River Valley. It was a big room, and the consultants, we'd get the test results. It took about 30 minutes, and we'd walk the people to another part of the building. And it was like a perp walk. People sat there and were just worried about their test results. They were wringing their hands. And we compounded that by making them walk, 100 yards. And in that area, 90% of the water was good. All we had to do is tell people you have great water, and the relief goes away and they start thinking about how to keep it good. But those communication, those human dimension elements are so important, and we've created a disconnect here where there's biases against doing this because I'm afraid of what it's gonna cost. I'm afraid of that, there's a whole series of things. So we're really trying to break down those barriers by giving well owners a chance to talk to people that know something about this.
We should move it.
I think maybe you answered it with the DOS program, but we had the Big Spring study here in Clayton County. And then there was a general awareness where there were sinkholes that we didn't want water to go into the sinkholes and make it surface water. And there was a great deal of money spent and a lot of dirt moved to protect the sinkholes. The water was diverted. And we had all that knowledge of land use created with data, good data, in the Big Spring study. And I wonder if you're even aware that we did that back, prior to when these tests started.
Guilty as charged.
Undercars.
I was not aware, and the Geological Survey is likely aware, and we work with them closely. And
Big Spring study.
yeah, I mean, the best thing the thing we try to do the most is collaborate with Geological Survey, with I mentioned that we're doing things with the Cancer Center on campus. Like we know there's limits to what we know, so that's useful. I'll look into it.
But I would say that the Geological Survey I got 13 sinkholes on my farm alone, and they died
Yeah.
and never figured out where it went.
Right?
Yeah, sometimes that happens.
How's the water in Canada?
What was that?
How's the water in Canada?
Depends on where you go. I think we have more questions than people raise hands. I think in the back was one.
Yeah, you could just, in general, go over the process of how to decide what to test for, what contaminant, if someone's gonna take a sample, how to take it, where to send it, things like that.
Right. Minnesota Health Department has guidance. They're saying if you have risk of bacteria, test it once a year, nitrates every other year, arsenic once, lead once, and manganese once. Now, we hand out a well portfolio with our well testing clinics that has that, and a place you can fill in the blanks of where you've done the test, and some other information about how to just get information about your well and connect with your well driller.
I would say in Iowa, contact your county public health
Yes,
office,
yes,
connect
yes.
you with your environmental specialist, your sanitarian. They do phenomenal work.
Yep.
We need more of them.
Right.
Probably need to pay them better, things like that.
Patty's taking names and numbers here.
I'm serious though, like there's backlogs of what can get done in certain counties. Why did Dubuque have no testing data for all these years? They didn't have the capacity. That's a shame. It shouldn't be that, right? This is important. That's the connection for you to clean water. I know we're running out of time. There's one
Still
here.
see 2 or 3 here.
So it was here, and then those two, and then we'll keep working through them.
The private well testing information you said is abysmal to get into. Is any of that because it legally is supposed to be private information, or is that public information that's just somehow hard to access?
It's public information. We've always treated it kind of carefully because, well, if someone has a contaminated well, it might affect their property value, just to talk plainly about it, right? But it is all publicly available, and on DNR's website, it's just very difficult to, what we would say is query, to try to pull the data out. If anybody wants data for the county, we're happy. We're gonna start giving that sort of summary data at the county level, not giving people's addresses. I think that's too far, right? So we gotta be careful with it for that reason, but there's still value in it. So it's DNR, I don't think does that. If you know how to access it, you can look up, it'll have the name of the owner, it'll have the address, it'll have all that info, it's all out there. But it's just difficult to get to because it's a clunky system.
Minnesota, it's different. In our clinics, that data is only for you. We don't share it with anybody. We make aggregate maps, but we can't identify on those maps where it is. It's by township. So if people don't want to give us their name, we don't care. It's for you to know, not us.
These last two should be the last ones, I think. And then I'm happy to stick around and take questions after.
Have you seen, for those counties, and I'm pointing especially with Northwest Iowa, that have large rural water systems, is that making the problem better or worse as you're replacing a lot of individual wells?
Well, I think my experience is it's probably making the problem better to a large degree for human consumption, because there's not a lot of wells up there anymore that are used for household use, at least that we're aware of. There's very little testing that's being done up there, not a lot of recent data. What's interesting about that is there's a lot of ag wells that are still active, that are in the private well tracking system, because they would be there as well, and we know next to nothing on the quality there. And I will just say that some of the old historical tests that are in northwest Iowa have some absurdly high nitrate levels. Like some of them are 100 milligram per liter levels. So there's reason to believe there's aquifers and groundwater there that's fairly contaminated, and we're hoping most people have moved off them. It's not always the case though. We're doing tests up there, and there are people still using them. It's just they're not as active in terms of testing.
One of the things we asked the US EPA for is kind of that type of assessment. Can you do a strategic plan to tell us, is it better to have a community water supplies? Do we drill out of this problem? Do we treat it? Do we ship water? They didn't do that. The state has the option of doing it. But in our terrain, it's hard to conceive of miles and miles of pipe buried 8 feet deep when you have to bust through so much bedrock. I mean, it's doable, but it's not a trivial task.
And last one right there.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, by the way, this has been so very interesting, and I appreciate your time. But so much of what we've talked about is the risk to drinking water and then the public health risk from drinking water. I'm a regional planner. We have economies in Northeast Iowa that are, a lot of them are natural resource economies. They rely on people coming to visit us and spend money because they're out in the waterways and they're out in the forest. And people live here and contribute to the economy because that's what they also do on the weekend. So we haven't talked a lot about monitoring and starting to think about and get organized around the surface waters and nitrates and other contaminants around that. I know that's a whole other meeting, but that is one huge area, and it's harder to put a finger on it, right? You can't easily, I know there's some monitoring of waterways, surface waterways, but it's not as easy as saying, let's get a good well in, let's update the well we have, let's get some, it's harder to put a finger on, so.
It is, but it's all ends up being connected in a lot of ways too, right? So, you know, if you have contaminated surface waters, it'll catch up to you one way or the other, and it will start impacting public supplies, and it'll impact alluvially connected wells. I mean, it's really not, you know, if I had my way, we'd take a much more holistic approach to how we protect our water resources. We do that source water protection he was talking about, both in ground and on surface. But it just takes a lot of work and will that we haven't seemed to be able to find.
There's a lot of different approaches, and the first thing I think in those contexts is make sure all the community water supplies are tested and safe. But we have people in our groups that say, we should just put up billboards. The water's not safe to drink here. That would be true, but that's not the message we want, right? So there's a lot of work to do in this coordination and communication is the point, so I'm glad you brought that up.
I'd like to mention, thank you very much for your presentations and your questions or your answers. Close by saying 3 quick things. Previous life, before I was a legislator, I was the director of a labor management council, which got unions and employers in the same room to talk about their mutual problems. You thought that was good training for being a legislator, maybe. One of the slogans I learned was, getting together is a start, staying together is progress, working together is success. And I think that's kind of going to be the challenge around this issue. How can we start, what can we do to start today to keep progress growing and going, and over the long term continue to work together? Which is one of the reasons I'd like to see some conversation around a potentially a Driftless Area Development and Conservation Authority. It wouldn't have to be just about drinking water. It wouldn't have to be just about water quality. It could be anything related to your natural resources and how you want to develop those and make them more attractive, not only for yourselves, but for anybody else who might want to move to this area in the future. It's a mechanism perhaps for working together. Second thing is, way out there, I know some states have, other states are considering constitutional amendments. This gets at your question about creating a right, an expectation on the part of everybody that they should have a clean environment. And it's called the Green Amendment, really a unique term, I suppose. Several states have it. New York most recently adopted. Basically gives the people a right to a clean and safe environment, and creates a positive obligation on government to not do things to compromise that right, and an obligation to address the things that are affecting that right. House Joint Resolution 10, it's not on your list, but if you wanna think way far ahead in big terms, think about potential big, effort to create a better backdrop for addressing not just drinking water issues, but a lot of environmental issues, especially those that have health impacts. Final thing I'll mention is, I've talked a little bit to the speakers about potentially recording the presentations that they gave tonight. You probably sat there and some of you and thought to yourself, oh, I know somebody else that needs to be hearing this thing. We're gonna try to, we wanted this to be an in-person meeting. We're gonna talk about recording the presenters here, maybe one more, try to package it into an hour-long Zoom meeting that we would record and then make available to you through your email addresses that you can then review yourself or share with anybody you want. So look forward to that potential going forward. And again, if you have any questions that weren't addressed, get them in the speakers' heads before they go. Maybe they can talk about that during their recorded presentation. Thanks again to our host. Thanks to my fellow elected officials who came tonight, current and former. And let's see what we can do to get together to continue these discussions.
Thank you so much.